Good evening and welcome. Tonight, we begin with a world that feels increasing. From the Middle East to Eastern Europe, from energy corridors to military front lines, the international system is facing a new wave of pressure. What we are witnessing is not a single isolated conflict, but a chain of crises unfolding In the past 24 hours, military tensions have intensified across key regions. Oil markets have reacted sharply, and governments around the world have been forced to reassess the possibility of escalation. Some of these developments are happening in open view. Others are unfolding quietly. Inside war rooms, diplomatic channels, intelligence briefings, and closed-door strategy. Tonight's report will not only summarize the headlines, it will go deeper. We will examine where the main F lay. This is not only a story about war, and tonight, we begin with the question that now hangs over the entire world. Are these still separate crises, or are they becoming one larger geopolitical confrontation? The single most important development today is that the war involving Iran has moved beyond a military confrontation and into a systemic global disruption event. Reuters reported that traffic through the Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz has been severely disrupted. Hundreds of tankers are idle, key Gulf producers have cut output, and oil prices briefly rose above $119 per barrel, prompting discussion among major governments and the IEA about emergency stock releases. At the same time, the conflict touched a highly sensitive NATO threshold when Turkey said a second Iranian ballistic missile entering its airspace was shot down by NATO defenses. Ankara did not invoke Article 4 or Article 5, but the incident sharply raises the risk that a Middle East war could begin to interact directly with alliance defense commitments. In Europe, Ukraine said it is ready for fresh peace talks at any moment, yet the battlefield has not cooled. Reuters also reported a Russian drone strike near an apartment block in Kharkiv, underscoring that diplomatic signaling and military pressure are continuing in parallel. In Africa, the United Nations said it is very alarmed by a series of drone strikes across Sudan in recent days, while eastern Congo remains unstable enough that the United States imposed sanctions on the Rwanda Defense Force last week over its role in the conflict there. The primary flashpoint is the Iran-Israel-US theater, stretching across Iran, Israel, the Persian Gulf, Lebanon, Turkey, and the Strait of Hormuz. This is the only active crisis today that simultaneously involves direct war, alliance risk, energy disruption, and immediate global market consequences. The second major flashpoint is Russia-Ukraine. Although it is receiving less global media attention than the Iran crisis today, it remains a high-intensity war with continued drone and missile activity and persistent pressure on civilians and infrastructure. The third flashpoint is Sudan, where the UN says drone attacks have spread across multiple states, particularly in West Kordofan, increasing humanitarian and state fragmentation risks. The fourth flashpoint is Eastern DRC, where the M23 conflict and outside involvement by Rwanda continue to keep the wider Great Lakes region unstable. In the Iran war, the latest major political development is the wartime consolidation of power around Mojtaba Khamenei, whom Reuters reported has been appointed Iran's new supreme leader. President Trump said the war could be over very soon, while also warning Iran not to block Middle East oil shipments. That combination of optimism and coercive warning suggests Washington is trying to hold open an off-ramp while preserving escalation dominance. A second major development is Russia's entry into the diplomatic frame. Reuters reported that Putin spoke with Trump and offered proposals to end the Iran war quickly. Whether those proposals are serious or opportunistic, Moscow is clearly trying to position itself as a power broker in a crisis that directly affects U.S. military bandwidth and global energy markets. In the NATO dimension, Turkey's claim that a second Iranian missile was intercepted after entering Turkish airspace is strategically significant because it suggests that spillover risk is no longer hypothetical. It is already testing the boundaries of alliance tolerance. In energy, the newest development is not just higher prices but physical distortion of supply logistics. Reuters reported that Iraq, Kuwait, Bahrain, and others have cut output or declared force majeure, and that hundreds of tankers are stalled. This means the conflict is already damaging the real movement of energy, not merely trader expectations. In Ukraine, the notable shift is political rather than military. Kyiv says it remains ready for talks, but Zelensky also argues that Russia is exploiting the Iran crisis to open a second front of pressure against the West. The Iran-Israel confrontation did not begin this week. It is the culmination of years of indirect confrontation across Syria, Lebanon, missile programs, proxy networks, and covert actions. What changed in 2026 is that the conflict appears to have moved from a shadow war into a far more overt military struggle involving direct U.S. participation and a strike severe enough to trigger a leadership succession in Iran. The Russia-Ukraine war has evolved from a failed rapid war concept into a long attritional conflict centered on drones, long-range strikes, industrial endurance, and external support networks. Today's Kharkiv strike fits that larger logic. Sudan reflects a different pattern, a state in deep internal fragmentation where rival armed centers of power have transformed political collapse into a prolonged war. The spread of drones adds a new technological layer to an already devastating conflict. Eastern Congo remains shaped by a combination of weak borders, armed movements, regional interference, and competition around mineral-rich territory. The recent U.S. sanctions on Rwanda's military confirm that outside involvement is no longer treated as a marginal issue. For the United States, the core interests are threefold: prevent Iran from breaking the regional security order, keep the Strait of Hormuz open, and reassure allies that Washington remains the ultimate security backstop. Reuters, reporting on Trump's statements and the market response, suggests the U.S. is now managing both a military war and an energy stability mission at the same time. For Israel, the strategic objective is to degrade Iran's ability to threaten Israel directly or through regional partners. The broader logic is deterrence through deep punishment. If Tehran continues its regional model, the price must become intolerably high. Reuters has also reported that the Iran war has disrupted other regional political agendas, including Trump's Gaza-related plans. For Iran, the immediate priority is regime survival. The rapid move to elevate Mojtaba Khamenei signals that Tehran's first wartime objective is continuity of command. If the state remains coherent, Iran can continue using missiles, drones, energy leverage, and regional partners as tools of deterrence. For Russia, the incentives are strategic and diplomatic. Moscow benefits if the U.S. is forced to divide attention and resources, but it also has reason to prevent complete chaos in oil markets. That is why Putin's outreach matters. Russia may be trying to convert crisis access into geopolitical leverage. For the Gulf states, especially Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, Qatar, and Bahrain, the overriding interest is survival through stability. Protect critical energy infrastructure, preserve export routes, and avoid being fully absorbed into the war. Their vulnerability is unusually high because geography, oil dependence, and U.S. security ties all intersect at once. When Trump says the war may end very soon, but also warns Iran not to interfere with oil shipments, the signal is layered. It tells U.S. domestic audiences that the administration sees the war as manageable, while telling Tehran that energy disruption is a red line that could trigger a more severe response. When the Kremlin says Putin has proposals to end the war quickly, the message is not simply about peace. It is also about relevance. Russia wants to be seen as a state that cannot be excluded from major crisis diplomacy, even beyond its own immediate theater. When NATO shoots down missiles threatening Turkey but avoids escalation language, the alliance is signaling controlled deterrence. It will defend territory, but it does not want an isolated missile incident to become an automatic collective war trigger. The IEA and G7 discussions around possible emergency stock releases also send a strategic message. The West does not intend to let any actor weaponize oil flows without a coordinated response. The United States remains the decisive military actor in the Middle East crisis, but that power comes with a burden. Every additional step toward escalation increases the risk of another prolonged regional war. Russia is acting like an opportunistic great power, using a crisis outside Europe to recover diplomatic influence while still fighting in Ukraine. The Kremlin's behavior suggests it sees the Iran war as both a threat and an opening. China is less visible in today's headlines, but structurally it is deeply exposed. Any disruption at Hormuz affects Asian energy security, and China has strong incentives to avoid a regional order being reshaped through open war. That is an inference based on the market and shipping realities reported today. The current picture is shaped by the overlap of formal alliances and informal proxy structures. NATO is the clearest formal alliance in the system. Iran's regional network, by contrast, represents the logic of asymmetric influence and proxy leverage. The fact that a missile incident involving Turkey now intersects with the Iran war shows how quickly those two systems can collide. Elsewhere, especially in Africa, alliances are often less explicit but still real. They take the form of arms support, political cover, cross-border military involvement, and competition over strategic territory and minerals. Eastern Congo remains a prime example. The clearest domino risk appears in three chains. The first is military, from Iran-Israel into Turkey, Lebanon, Gulf bases, and possibly wider alliance entanglement. The second is energy, from Hormuz disruption into oil prices, LNG costs, shipping insurance, and inflation. The third is financial, from higher energy prices into revised growth expectations, tighter market sentiment, and pressure on equities and consumers. Reuters separately reported that surging oil is already worrying U.S. stock investors. That does not guarantee a world war. It does mean the system is in a state where a regional shock can now become a multi-region strategic crisis very quickly. The biggest global impact right now is energy. Reuters reported that oil surged to its highest level since 2022, producers cut output, and governments began discussing emergency stock measures. That is the signature of a real macroeconomic shock, not just a geopolitical scare. The second impact is on supply chains. When tankers are stalled and producers are forced into irregular export patterns, costs rise, timings slip, and downstream industries absorb the pressure. The third impact is on financial markets. Higher oil prices typically worsen inflation expectations and undermine equity sentiment, especially in the United States and other major consuming economies. Reuters reported fresh concern among U.S. stock investors about precisely this dynamic. The greatest security danger is not only continued fighting, but unintended escalation between regular armed forces. A second Iranian missile incident involving Turkish airspace raised U.S. readiness in the Middle East, and a tightening NATO missile defense posture together mean the margin for error is narrowing. Once oil flows shipping routes, and alliance defense systems are all under stress at the same time, the crisis is no longer merely Middle Eastern. It becomes a test of the international system's ability to prevent a regional war from becoming a wider strategic breakdown. Iran and Israel are the two states facing the most direct military consequences. But if measured by exposure to the intersection of war, energy, and alliance politics, the next most vulnerable group is the Gulf states: Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, Qatar, and Bahrain. Turkey is a particularly dangerous special case. Another serious missile incident with casualties could trigger intense domestic and alliance pressure. Outside the region, the most exposed major economies are those heavily dependent on imported Middle Eastern energy, especially in Asia and parts of Europe. Reuters reporting on emergency discussions and oil-driven investor concerns supports that conclusion. In Africa, Sudan remains one of the heaviest humanitarian casualties of today's instability, while Eastern DRC continues to suffer from entrenched armed violence and regional interference. The international response is splitting into three broad tracks. The first is de-escalation diplomacy, efforts by outside powers and regional actors to prevent the Iran war from widening. Russia's outreach is part of this track, regardless of motive. The second is defensive containment. NATO defensive adjustments, Turkish air defense actions, and heightened protection around Gulf infrastructure. The third is market stabilization, emergency energy discussions, possible stock releases, and broader attempts to calm prices and shipping risk. That combination shows the world is treating the Iran war not just as a security emergency, but as a systemic geopolitical economic shock. Scenario 1. Controlled de-escalation. The U.S. continues coercive pressure, Iran avoids fully closing Hormuz, and outside actors help create a limited off-ramp. Oil stays elevated but stabilizes. Today's Trump and Putin messaging suggests this path is still open. Scenario 2. Prolonged regional war below full system breakdown. Iran remains intact. The U.S. and Israel fail to achieve a decisive political end state, and missile, drone, and shipping disruptions continue. Based on the current structure of incentives, this may be the most plausible near-term scenario. Scenario 3. Sudden escalation. A major strike on NATO territory, severe casualties at a U.S. base, or a much larger interruption to oil flows could rapidly move the crisis into a new phase. The current missile incidents involving Turkey show how narrow that threshold may be. The biggest meaning of March 9, 2026, is that the world has entered a phase in which major conflicts are no longer strategically separate. The Iran war is shaking oil markets. Oil volatility is shaking financial sentiment. NATO is being pulled closer to the edge. Russia is using the Middle East crisis to reinsert itself into big power diplomacy. And other wars like Ukraine, Sudan, and Congo continue to degrade the broader international order at the same time. In other words, this is not merely a collection of simultaneous conflicts. It is an interconnected geopolitical risk environment in which the decisions of a small number of leaders can alter military balances, oil prices, market psychology, and alliance credibility all at once. The greatest danger right now is not one war in isolation, but the cumulative effect of several crises interacting together.